All right. Well, thanks everyone again for joining us today. My name's Dan Deacon, and I'm joined today by my colleagues Lindsay DeSalvo and Micah Smith, and we're kicking off what I believe is the sixth installment of our 2022 OSHA webinar series. And today we're going to be talking about evacuating the workplace, exit routes, and exit doors. So we're going to be focusing specifically on egress safety under 1910.36 and 1910.37. And we're going to go through some historical context of those two standards, the key enforcement of several of those provisions and key items that you need to make sure that you get right in your workplace, and also some key compliance tips and steps to make sure that you are in tip-top shape when it comes to egress safety. So we're going to go ahead and dive right in, and we're going to start with the top 3 reasons it's important to get exit and evacuation compliance issues right. And we're going to start first with a little bit of a historical context. The first one being that exit safety is a high priority from OSHA, and this really traces back to the early 1900s, and really could go back to the early 1800s, when the 1890s, I should say, when the NFPA was first installed and created. But this has been a foundational safety issue since the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, and it remains a key OSHA enforcement priority. And again, for some historical context, that Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire occurred back in March of 1911, and it was a fire that spread through a cramped garment factory on the upper floors of a building in Lower Manhattan. And it was a pretty significant case. 146 workers died. The building only had one fire escape, which collapsed during rescue efforts. There were long tables, bulky machines that trapped many workers, and there had been doors locked by management to prevent theft. So these are some of the key things that OSHA today, over 110 years later, is still looking at, right? Blocked exit routes, locked doors, or doors that are difficult to open, be it a key or some type of special knowledge. But this was the deadliest workplace tragedy in New York City up until 9/11, 90 years later. And it is still something that OSHA targets as in their enforcement efforts. And the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire is still listed on OSHA's website. There's a dedicated page to the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, focusing specifically on egress safety. So that's something that is unique to these two standards that we're going to be talking about today, 1910-36 and 37. It is a key enforcement priority for OSHA, and it is somewhat of a low-hanging fruit items that OSHA can identify easily during walkthrough inspections. So again, we're going to get into some key compliance tips and steps to make sure that you are not finding yourself in one of those on-site inspections where OSHA can easily identify one of these egress safety issues. But again, going back to that 1911 Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, there was significant public outcry that brought renewed urgency to the labor movement and the women's rights and immigrants' workplace rights movements. The first life safety code was developed in 1913, so shortly after this fire, and NFPA had been in the works for about 15, 20 years at that point, and there was this renewed emphasis and focus on egress and fire safety around this time. So the second reason it is important to get this right, and I kind of alluded to this just a few minutes ago, is that these standards can be easily cited, and typically they can be cited as repeat or willful. So manufacturing and retail settings have quite an extensive history of egress violations. Some of the notable recent enforcement history, just dating back, the past 5-6 years, two of employers that you may have seen in a lot of OSHA press releases are Dollar General and Dollar Tree. As you can see on the screen here, Dollar General has been fined more than $3.6 million for egress over the past 6 years, and Dollar Tree's been fined more than $9.3 million for egress violations over the past 6 years. And just recently, Dollar General, I think it was last week, Dollar General was issued 4 willful citations with $435 in penalties. And those were the regulations that we're going to be talking about today. 1910-37 A3 for exit routes being obstructed by carts and containers in the back rooms. 1910-36 D1 for the inability to open an exit door without special knowledge, tools, or keys. And then some other ones that tangentially touch on egress safety, but 1910-303 G1 for blocked electrical panels and also blocked portable fire extinguishers under 1910-157. So an overwhelming majority of those citations that have been issued to those two employers over the past several years have been issued as willful and repeat. And as I mentioned, this is something that is easily identified during an on-site inspection. So if you are inspected on a frequent and regular basis, this is something that OSHA can find quite easily. And the exposure, the risk is quite significant, especially if you have one on your record. So if you do receive one of these citations under 1910-36 or 1910-37, or perhaps even in the material handling context, blocked electrical panels, blocked portable fire extinguishers, those are some items that you're going to want to take a close look at and certainly consider contesting to see if you can get those removed from your record, because they can be easily cited again as repeat or in certain egregious contexts as a willful citation. And as you all know, those repeat or willful citations can carry penalties in excess of $165,000, $170,000. So carrying on with the significant enforcement piece, it is easily cited, and this slide shows you over the past 3 years anyway, just how many times it has been cited by OSHA. And we outlined all of the different types of citations that have been issued under both of these standards here, including the willful citations, repeat, serious, other than serious. But it is a significant number of citations that are issued on an annual basis, and this is nationwide. So as you can see, over the past 3 years, we've had, close to 2,000 citations issued under these two standards, many of which have been classified as you see there, willful and repeat. Moving on to the civil penalty aspect of this, it does carry some significant fines. Over the past 3 years alone under these two standards, so this isn't taking into account some of those other egress and blocked safety issues like electrical panels or fire extinguishers. Just under 1910-36 and 1937 alone, we have about $2.9 million in fines over the last 3 years under 1910-36 and $11.9 million in fines issued under 1937. And if we tie in the blocked extinguishers and electrical panels, that's about another $4.5 million in fines issued under those related standards, 1910-57 and 1910-303. So collectively, this is, as I mentioned, easily cited, and the penalties add up quick, especially when we're talking about those repeat and willful citations. As you see on the screen here, there's been close to 140 willful and repeat citations issued over the past 3 years under these two standards alone. So it is low-hanging fruit, easily cited, with some significant penalties associated with it. So the message here is really, if you get these citations, you do want to contest these and work through several of your strategies, defense strategies, to get these off your record, or at least modified to an alternative standard that poses significantly less risk. So now we're going to go into an overview of these two standards, and I'm going to turn it over to Micah to cover the next few slides.
Thanks, Dan. So now that you know what's important or why it's important to do this, let's dig into some of the details. Unfortunately, not everything in this standard is terrifically intuitive. It doesn't always make sense until you dig in and fully get into the world of the standard and understand how some of the terms are used. So I decided literally 2 minutes ago, I want to go backwards and looking at this. So Dan, could you skip ahead 2 slides to go to the definitions? There we go. All right, so this is one of the things I was referring to. We've got 4 main definitions in the OSHA standard here. And the way they work together, as I said, it's not terribly intuitive, and the words that they use to describe these things, it doesn't match with sort of the common usage. So the first definition that you need to know is exit route. The exit route, as we have signaled in here, it consists of 3 parts. It has an exit access, an exit, and an exit discharge. And the way to think about the exit route is it's going to take an employee from the place where they work, wherever that is, if they're sitting at a desk, if they're working on a factory line, if they're operating a machine, wherever they are, the exit route takes them from their workstation all the way outside. And so you've got to connect the parts and get the folks from where they work to how they get outside. Now, the 3 parts, there's three sections here, but they don't, they're not equally as big in every situation. So let's start with the last one, exit discharge. So essentially, this is going to be the last door. This is going to be the way that you leave the building and get all the way to safety. Usually, I think of it in most places, it's a very short distance. It's literally from the door, and you take a couple steps, and now you're outside. You have exited the building. There may be some times when it is longer if you've got folks that have left a building, but maybe they're going down a ramp outside until they finally hit the ground and they're fully safe. But the exit discharge, normally we don't talk all that much about it, other than say where it has to be, where it has to take you. But that exit discharge is the last piece of the route. Moving back, the exit is going to be the area that is essentially dedicated for exits. You shouldn't think of the exit part of the exit route as part of the workplace. It is separated. It is designated. It is specifically built for the purpose of getting people all the way to the exit discharge. This is going to include things like stairwells. We've all been in office buildings, and we've popped out into the, we're normally taking the elevators, but if we ever have an occasion to use the stairs, there's these industrial looking stairs. There's not a lot in there, lots of concrete, lots of steel. And so that's what your exit portion of the exit route is really going to look like many times. Now, it's also going to include, there may be times when you have, instead of just going vertical with stairs or something like that, you may have some horizontal exit areas if you're trying to go across or move through a building, particularly if you've got a long or very large footprint building. You may have some of those as well. All right, so that's the exit. So think of the exit as this very undecorated industrial space that's taking you from the workplace out to the exit discharge. Finally, exit access, and this is the one that trips lots of people up. This is what gets you from where you're working all the way to the exit, to the exit passage. So the reason people trip up on this is because if you're sitting at a desk right now, your exit access starts essentially at the edge of your chair and carries you, and you need to have an exit access that carries you all the way to the exit. So this is going to get a lot of hallways. This is going to go through areas where you have active work. Maybe you have production lines, maybe you have conveyors, things like that. And so it gets fairly complicated and many times to keep those exit accesses very clear, because it's where you're doing your work. People spend lots of time there. They have tasks. They get comfortable. So this is where a lot of the citations are going to come, and so we'll talk more about that in just a second. So now that you've got a good handle on that, exit access, exit discharge, those 3 make up the exit route. Let's get back and talk about the substance of these standards here. Before we dig into 1910-36, one caveat, which we didn't really flag, but I know that Dan already talked about the life safety code. 1910-35 gives you essentially an out. It says, you know, if you are your compliance with standard is required, but in case you didn't want to comply with every single piece of this, or if you found a certain part of it difficult or impossible to comply with, you do have an out. It's the life safety code. If you comply with the life safety code, then OSHA will deem you to be in compliance with 1910, 36, and 37. Now, if you do go that direction, we should give you a warning with that. You're going to have to be able to prove that you're in compliance with the life safety code. And as with any specification standard, it's very detailed, and it can be challenging to meet every single provision of a standard that is that long. It's an entire book. And so it can be challenging, and it's up to you to demonstrate that you have complied with that. And so if you're having a discussion with an OSHA compliance officer, it can be challenging. So, all right, Dan, could you skip back to the 1910-36 slide, please? Let's talk about what's contained here. All right, so 1910-36 is going to be the section of standard that talks about the design and construction requirements. So how do you build it? What does it have to look like? 1910-37 is going to be how you maintain it. So here's the key requirements here under 1910-36. Number one, the exit routes have to be permanent. You know, if you are working in a building, the exit routes can't be changing constantly. They can't be done with, you know, cheap temporary materials. They need to be built. They need to be designed for the building, and they need to be, you know, well designed for whatever's happening there. Now, number two, and this is why we did the definitions first, exits must be separated by fire-resistant materials. This is going to be that portion of the exit. It's not going to be the exit access where you go from your desk out to get the exit itself. This is going to be that industrial-looking area that's going to be all concrete, steel, and it has to be created with fire-resistant materials. Hopefully, this was taken care of when your building was designed. But you know, if you're moving into a new building, you're taking over something from someone else, it may be something you need to assess, is whether your exit was designed with the right materials. Now, moving on down, there's requirements that you have to have an adequate number of exit routes. The general rule is you have to have at least two. But as we've noted here, depending on the number of employees, size of building, occupancy, your engine of the workplace, what you're doing in there, you may be able to get away with one exit if it is a small enough area and a small enough number of employees, or if it's significant, you may find that you need more than two exit routes. So, you know, take a look at that. Be ready to explain why you have enough, why you know that you have enough exit routes. As I mentioned earlier, when we're talking about the definitions of the exit discharge, there's a requirement that it has to lead directly outside to a street, some kind of an open area. So you've got to make sure that your exit route isn't done, the exit discharge isn't done until you get folks outside, away from what is presumably going to be a dangerous area in the event of a fire. So look at your exit discharges, make sure they're taking people somewhere safe. All right, number 5, exit doors have to be unlocked, and employees have to be able to open from the inside at all times. This is your classic triangle shirtwaist problem, where folks were inside, doors were locked, and they couldn't get out. So this tends to be a fairly easy requirement, but you know, there may be areas of your workplace that you have certain security requirements. Maybe it's a server room, or maybe you use hazardous equipment somewhere. You know, there may be complicated areas that you have to deal with. You may have to get creative with some of the problem solving, but at the end of the day, you've got to have easy access. These things have to be unlocked from the inside so that folks can get out, you know, at a moment's notice. Number 6, this sometimes trips people up. It seems simple, but it can catch you out. You have to use a side hinged exit door to connect any room to an exit route. So, you know, if you, the arrangement that comes into my mind is if you assign somebody to work in a, you know, a storage building, it's got lots of different pods with roll-up doors, that wouldn't be a compliant workspace, because if they go inside their little pod, roll down that garage door, they don't have a side hinged exit door to get out. You know, probably you're not putting your people in a storage area, but you know, you may have some interesting or unique kind of warehouse areas or things like that you may not have side hinged doors. So make sure if you have any strange spaces like that, take a look. Make sure you've got those to get out of the building that way. All right, last two, the exit route has to support the maximum permitted occupant load. You know, make sure you're not relying on a fire escape that's not strong enough to support everybody's weight as they're coming out. You know, make sure it's a design for the folks who are going to have to go out. And last is the exit access has to be 28 inches wide and at least 7.5 feet tall. So make sure those areas are big enough. All right, now that you've got your exits designed, let's go to the next slide and talk about how do you maintain it. Because, you know, designing an exit route it's you know, mostly a one-time thing, but keeping it up it's a daily struggle, as I'm sure many of you know. All right, so main requirements. The words to think about are free and unobstructed. So number one, make sure there's no materials in the way. It tends to be fairly easy on the exit discharge and the exit. Right? These are areas that are clearly designed for use in an emergency, but you've got to keep an eye on that for your exit access. So if you've got a path, you know, the path by which employees are going to have to travel in order to get to that exit, and folks are moving carts out there, buckets, tubs, totes, conveyors, anything like that, you've got a potential OSHA violation right there, because at any moment, those folks may need to go down that exit access in order to get to the exit. So this is probably one of the most common problems folks have. So you got to make sure you keep free and unobstructed. Moving back to number one, make sure that there's nothing explosive, highly flammable, or other things that could be dangerous, right? Make sure you don't have stacks of paper in there that could light up and cause a problem in your exit route. All right, so number 3 and 4, you've got to make sure your exit route is adequately lighted so that folks can see while they're exiting. You've got to make sure that the exit is marked by a sign that says exit. That's you know, fairly simple, but if you look over at number 7, you've got to make sure that your exit sign is illuminated sufficiently, right? Do you have a bright enough light on it, or is it self-illuminated? If it is, you know, you've got to make sure that that is bright enough. All right, 5 and 6, you've got to make sure that if it's not obvious how you're getting to the exit, that you've got signs helping people along the way. This tends to be something of a judgment call, and it's achieving compliance here is more of an art than a science. So, you know, too many signs gets confusing, not enough signs, and you'll find yourself in violation. So watch that one. If there is a door or a passageway that's on your exit access that looks like maybe it looks like an exit, but it's not, you've got to make sure that that's marked so that folks know, you know, here we are on the 2nd floor, and that looks like an exit door, but it actually takes you to somewhere in the garage. You need to mark that as not an exit so that they know to keep going, and they'll be at the exit, you know, soon. So that's an important thing. The last one is, it's kind of a catch-all, number 8 here. You've got to make sure that all of your employee alarm, sprinkler systems, and other protective devices are operable and in working order. It's kind of a random requirement that OSHA threw in there, but, you know, essentially, if you have systems in place to protect people while they're exiting, or to warn them that they need to exit, you've got to make sure that they're in working order. Otherwise, that can be a violation of the exit route provision. All right, so with that, I'm going to hand it over to Lindsay to talk about the top egress violations.
All right, thank you, Micah. So before we hop into the top egress violations, which will just sort of give us an opportunity to dig in a little bit deeper on some of those specific requirements that that Michael was talking about under 1910.36 and 1910.37, I just wanted to sort of make a point going back to Dan's initial discussion about sort of why this is important. And, you know, just to sort of add to that, I think there's greater significance in the context of these exit standards because of the fact that they apply so broadly too. You know, there are a lot of workspaces that are highly regulated by OSHA, that have a lot of OSHA requirements and standards that are applicable to them. But there are also, you know, spaces like office spaces where there aren't really a lot of OSHA requirements that an employer needs to consider. But these exit route requirements and these exit requirements more generally are going to be applicable to every workplace. So they're going to be applicable to those office space settings. So the requirements that we discuss here are also going to be something that an employer who, you know, might have manufacturing facilities and then also have sort of their main, you know, office headquarters, these requirements are going to apply in both of those spaces. So I just sort of, again, wanted to add that additional layer of importance and significance here. So the first egress violation that we're going to talk about, it's kind of, this slide and the next slide are kind of together. We consider these together, but the first one is exit route must be free and unobstructed. So Mike already kind of talked about this generally and what the requirements are, and it's pretty clear from the standard that, you know, the exit, what has been designated as the exit route, has to be free of any obstruction so that it can be easily accessed in the case of an emergency. This is one that we see come up very often. This is one that I personally have addressed related to inspections and enforcement actions quite frequently. And so one of the things we wanted to discuss in the context of this is an exception to keeping the exit route clear and unobstructed. And it's a very limited exception. There still has to be an unobstructed path, but there can be sort of some obstruction in that path in this very limited circumstance. And this is something that was developed in a settlement agreement between OSHA and UPS back several, I guess a few years ago now. But what OSHA said after the settlement agreement was, you know what, we are going to apply this standard outside of just the context of the settlement agreement with UPS, because it was a way for the agency to recognize that there are some circumstances where, you know, strict maintenance of a clear and unobstructed path is not going to be possible. But again, this is a very narrow exception, and it's really supposed to be limited to those employers that are performing delivery services. And they actually have a specific NAICS code in the memo that explains how this exception works. So where this exception is going to apply is, again, generally in the delivery services context, but it's where packages are temporarily placed in an exit route, and that's important. You know, it certainly can't be the case anything is being stored in an exit route. It has to be that these packages were temporarily placed in the exit route. And then there's sort of three additional components to consider within that. So, and those packages are placed so as to leave at least some path for the exit access, even if it's less than the 28 inches, which is what, you know, we'll talk about in the next slide. The packages are placed so that they can be immediately moved if there is an emergency. You know, so again, they're not sort of positioned or stored in a way that, or placed in a way that, you know, they're being stored in any manner. If there's like heavy packages that are obstructing the path, and that could be problematic, but they need to be placed in a way that they can be immediately moved if an emergency occurs. And then specifically in the context of unloading a trailer for delivery purposes, a supervisor also has to monitor the conditions and ensure that obstructions are minimized. So these things need to be set in place. There have to be policies in place applicable to this situation, but this is a limited exception. We have, in the context of employers and industries outside of the delivery services, relied on this memo to say, look, in similar situations, an exception like this should also apply. OSHA doesn't recognize that outside of the delivery services context, but we have certainly used that as a basis for a defense, particularly in situations, like with warehouse storage and retail, where you might have similar circumstances. A delivery comes in and it's temporarily, these packages are put, within the context or within the confines of an exit route, but meet the requirements of the exception. We have argued in that case that OSHA should treat those situations similarly. But that is one sort of limited exception. But the goal really should be to keep the designated exit paths free and unobstructed per this requirement. We also kind of wanted to mention that, in these situations where you do have things placed in a manner that may potentially obstruct an exit, you could also have other standards, other OSHA standards that might be implicated. We mentioned here ones that we see come up quite often in this situation, which is material handling, specifically 1910.176B, that materials must be stored in a stable and secure way. We've seen OSHA cite employers where there are, packages or other materials that may be placed in an exit path. And if OSHA thinks they're being stored, they might also try to cite 1910.176 if they don't think they're stored in a stable way. We've also seen OSHA cite 1910.303G1, which is, I think, one that was touched on already in the presentation, but that sufficient access space must be available around electrical panels. So again, if something has been placed in an exit route and that exit route also happens to be close to an electrical panel, OSHA might also assert that whatever is positioned there might be blocking the electrical panel as well and try to support a citation under that standard. And then the walking working surfaces context, the workplace needs to be kept clear of tripping hazards in pathways. So you could certainly see a citation under the walking working surfaces standard for a situation like that as well. So in the next slide, like I said, the 1910.37A3 and 1910.36G2 tend to go hand in hand. So the exit path has to be clear and unobstructed. You also have to have the full 28 inches for the exit access. And OSHA has guidance that says that this means all components of an exit access have to meet that 28-inch requirement. So if there is a stairway that is considered part of an exit access, that stairway also has to be 28 inches wide, even if, the specific standard for the stairway might not require that it be 28 inches wide. If it's part of the exit access, then it has to meet that 28-inch wide requirement. And like I said, OSHA has guidance specifically saying that. This standard would also require where there is only one exit access leading to an exit or exit discharge, that the exit itself and the exit discharge also meet that 28-inch requirement. So because it goes hand in hand with 1910.37A3, that same limited exception that we talked about that comes from the UPS corporate-wide settlement agreement would also apply if OSHA came to incite and was, evaluating a situation that meets the requirements of that exception. And then again, there are standards outside of just the exit standards that might be implicated if there are obstructions that are limiting the width of an exit access to less than 28 inches. So on the next slide, our third sort of main egress violation, our exit routes must be visible and marked with an exit sign. And we do see this come up quite often, where you have an exit that maybe the sign, there was a sign there originally, but the sign fell off, or the sign has been obstructed by something else. Someone has put something over the actual exit portion of the sign. We've seen this come up in a lot of different contexts. And one of the things that we wanted to highlight related to this standard, because we've made this argument before, we've used this as a defense before, and we found it is helpful. And Micah already mentioned this in his portion of the webinar, but there is a standard, 1910.35, which says that OSHA will deem an employer that demonstrates compliance with NFPA 101, the Life Safety Code, to be in compliance and meeting the requirements of the other exit route standards, 1910.34, 1910.36, and 1910.37. And significantly, in the context of, the requirement to have an exit sign and the exit sign be visible, the NFPA 101, the Life Safety Code, does say that an exit sign is not required if a door is obviously and clearly identifiable as an exit. So again, a limited exception, but if you have a door that is clearly identifiable as an exit, then an exit sign may not be required in that context. The Life Safety Code goes on to sort of discuss where this might apply, specifically where there's a main entrance that also serves as an exit. If it's a main entrance, it's being used on a regular basis, that could be a situation where it is clearly an exit and wouldn't necessarily need to have an exit sign above the door. They also talk about, or the code talks about, that if it's a transient workforce, employees in and out of this building, not really a lot of consistency in who is in the building, then, this argument is quite weakened. There really might not be a good handle on what doors are considered exit doors. But if it's permanent employees who are there day in and day out, very familiar with the workspace or the facility, then, you could have a stronger argument here that if the door is obviously an exit, it doesn't necessarily need a sign. We would, definitely counsel that having an exit sign above an exit door is what you want to do. That is the goal. But if for some reason that is not the case and OSHA, issues a citation based on that, this could be a potential defense if the door is obviously and clearly identifiable as an exit. So the next one that we'll talk about briefly, exit door must be unlocked from the inside at all times. Micah talked about this one a little bit. I won't spend too much additional time on it, but OSHA does have guidance that says an additional layer of protection beyond the use of a panic bar, which is permitted. A panic bar is allowed on an exit door because it can be easily compressed. There's no actual obstruction or limitation on the ability to open it from the inside, even though it might be locked from the outside. A panic bar is an acceptable safeguard to have on an exit door. However, adding any additional layer beyond that, that would be a violation of the standard. So there is guidance out there where, you might have an electronic device in proximity to the door that has to be compressed before the panic bar will be able to be compressed itself to get out the exit. Then that's an additional layer that is considered an obstruction to their ability to readily use the exit door, and that would not be permissible under the standard. Dan pointed out in the beginning, there was an employer recently who was cited for a few willful violations of the exit standard. One of them was this particular standard, 1910.36 D1, because there was, I believe, a piece of wood through one of the doors and maybe a lock on it, so that limited the ability to open the door from the inside. It was a willful violation in this instance, and the penalty for just that violation was $145,000 is issued. So I think this one seems fairly straightforward, but there are some important things to sort of consider in the context of ensuring that an exit door can easily be unlocked from the inside. And then the fifth one that we'll talk about is sort of a few different standards, but they all kind of work together, which is the number of exit routes that you have to have in a facility. And this is sort of a theme, I think a running theme that you'll see with some of these exit requirements, is that it sort of depends on the facility you're in, the type of building you're in, how big it is, how partitioned it is, how many employees are in the building. The general requirement is that there has to be 2 exit routes, but that can change based on, again, sort of the actual number of employees, the size of the facility, how it's arranged. It might be, if it's a small facility, open, you could potentially be allowed to have a single exit route for those employees, as long as the number of employees isn't so large that they all wouldn't be able to get out through that exit route. And then on the other end of that, if it's a particularly large facility, if there's a lot of partition to the facility, if there's a lot of employees working in the facility, you might need to have more than 2 exit routes. And that's something that the employer would have to evaluate in putting together an emergency plan and procedure and specifying those particular exit routes. So I will now turn it over to Dan to talk about the last few major egress violations.
Thanks, Lindsay. The next one that we're going to talk about is 29 CFR 1910 37B4, and this is related to the direction of travel signs to an exit that is not readily apparent. So if the direction of travel to an exit or exit discharge isn't immediately apparent, and we'll talk a little bit about what that means, you need to have signs or some kind of directional signals posted along that exit access indicating the direction of travel to that nearest exit and exit discharge. So this comes up a lot of times, and I think Lindsay touched on this, right? If you're in just a single room that has an immediate an apparent view of where that exit is, you're not going to need directional signs. But the context in which this comes up a lot is in warehouses where you have large stacks or racking, where the immediate site and direction to the nearest exit is not immediately apparent from, for example, if you're in one of those aisles that has significant racking where you can't see an exit discharge. So a lot of times we get into conversations with OSHA about where that exit is, where the route is, and whether it is immediately apparent where an employee needs to go. And this is really a performance-oriented standard. Sometimes you'll get OSHA pushing that you need reflective tape on the ground, leading people to the exit route. There's a lot of different interpretations of what is and isn't required, but really, and you see it at the bottom of the screen here, this is a 1985 interpretation letter. If the inspector gets lost, you need exit signs and those directional signals. If the inspector can immediately find the exit, no exit sign or direction signals will be required here. So like I said, it's a performance-oriented standard, and you have to really evaluate the construct and the physical layout of your workspace and where employees traditionally work, where work activities are going, and evaluate whether it is readily apparent and immediately apparent where those exit routes and the exit discharge are. If it isn't, you need to have some kind of directional signal, be it tape on the ground, floor markings leading to the exit route and the exit access. There's a few different ways that you can handle it, right? The floor markings, signage, but the gist of this advice here is, right, if you would get lost or it's not immediately apparent where that exit route is, where an employee can walk immediately to the exit discharge from where they're working in the workplace, you need to have some type of signal, some type of signage or floor markings directing them to that nearest exit route and exit access. So the next slide that we're going to go over here is exit sign illumination. And we've touched on this a little bit throughout the presentation. This is under 1910 37B6. And that requires each exit sign be illuminated to a surface value of at least 5-foot candles by a reliable light source and be in a distinctive color. So there's a few different ways that you can handle your exit sign illumination. There's the internal illumination, where the exit sign has light bulbs inside. There's the external illumination option, in which lights from the outside of the exit sign itself illuminate that, so it's readily apparent and visible to all employees in the workplace. And there's also the self-illuminated, the fluorescent type exit signs that can be used as well. So the guidance that OSHA has issued explains that the lighted signs can be any color or combination of colors, as long as, again, it's readily visible or distinctive in appearance. And you know, the key context that we see violations under this standard a lot of times are where it is a internal illuminated exit sign and perhaps a light bulb has burnt out, right? It's an easy identified issue for OSHA when they're doing that on-site inspection. If they notice that the exit sign is not illuminated at all, that's an easy citation for them to write up. And it is difficult for them to make this evaluation of, well, what is at least 5-foot candles? So a lot of times you'll get an inspection file that just says the exit sign wasn't illuminated, but they're not taking into consideration whether there was external illumination, whether there was emergency lighting that would have made this illuminated. So this is one that you can really push back on, because a lot of times that evaluation of whether it was illuminated to a surface value of at least 5-foot candles isn't really made by an OSHA inspector, nor do I really think that they know how to make that evaluation. The final one, the 8th and final top egress violation, is the not exit sign issue that we've talked about a little bit as well. And that's under 1910-37B5. So each doorway or passage along an exit access that could be mistaken for an exit needs to be marked as not an exit or some other designation, right? If it's an office, if it's a janitor's closet, a lab, whatever it may be, it needs to be marked as such so as not to confuse an employee that it is or could be an exit or the way to an exit route, right? So if you have hallways that are along an exit route leading to an exit discharge with doors, other closets that could potentially be mistaken for a way out of the facility, the building, you want to make that evaluation and mark those doors appropriately, whatever they may be. This is a pretty simple fix. It doesn't need to be a fancy sign. It doesn't need to be otherwise marked as exit signs do, right? With at least 6-inch lettering, lit up. It just needs to be marked as not an exit or something similar designating that it isn't one.
Dan?
Yep.
Before we jump into this last section here, one thing I wanted to note, we are discussing today specifically the OSHA requirements, but it is also important to keep in mind that some facilities may also be regulated by certain building codes or fire codes, in addition to any requirement from OSHA. So it is also important for employers to be aware of the requirements within those, like state-specific, for instance, codes that might require something additional or slightly different. Again, you can certainly, to meet the OSHA expectations and requirements, follow the standards that OSHA provides, but it is also important to keep in mind that there might be some additional requirements in local or state fire or building codes.
Great, thanks. Now I think we're going to turn it over to Micah, and he's going to kick us off with some compliance tips for you all to consider. So Micah, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, so while we go through this last section of slides, I also want to try to loop in some of the questions. We've got a lot of good questions in the chat, and so we're going to try to bring that in because I think it lines up well. What our goal here with this section on compliance tips is, how do you actually operationalize this? How do you live your life, right? It's one thing to sit here and read the standards. It's another thing to walk out into your facility and know what to do, know whether you're doing enough. So I'll try to loop in some questions while we go through this. Let's start off with the essentially the obstruction question. It's one of the major issues. Yeah, if you can go to the next slide, I think it'll give us some guidance here. We're dealing mainly with obstruction, and that can be in the form of physical obstructions or in terms of locks. So we've got a question here about someone referenced folks who are selling exit doors or exit controls for, sorry, I've lost it, for a place like a gas station or a mini mart, so that the cashier, presumably who's in a safe location, can press a button and lock a thief inside. Is that going to be legal? I think the answer to that is going to be that OSHA will be very skeptical of such a system, right? Because the rule is you have to have an unobstructed exit, right? Now, with that said, if we go back to what Lindsay was talking about with these, exceptions where you can have brief obstructions, so long as they're well controlled and they can't remain through an emergency, I think you might be able to have such a system. This is going to be entirely spitballing on my part, but I would imagine that if you have a switch or a key or something that you turn, and if you turn it, then the door is closed, locked, and can't be opened. There's no panic bar that will let you out. I think you have an OSHA violation on your hands, probably. If, on the other hand, maybe you have instead of a key or a switch that's flipped, what if you have a button that, so long as the button is held, it will stay closed, but as soon as you release it, it opens back up. Maybe that would work. I can imagine, you've got one problem might be if the button is on a counter, or what if somebody accidentally sets a book on top of it and presses it down? That might cause you a problem. So it's an interesting question. It's an interesting technology and idea that is potentially a problem, but maybe there's a way you can make it work. Of course, you've got to balance a lot of equities there, and you've got competing interests. So maybe that's an option. We had a question also about time-delayed panic bars. That's not something I've ever encountered. Lindsay or Dan, do you guys have any ideas on that one? My guess is OSHA would be very skeptical about it, but maybe I'm wrong.
I don't have specific experience with a situation like that, but I would have a similar thought, Micah, in that it would be sort of, I think, very dependent on the delay. I mean, if it's a mere 1 or 2 seconds, maybe that would not be so much of an issue. But, OSHA is really going to, I think the important thing to keep in mind, and you're kind of saying this, is that OSHA is going to take a real close look at that. The point here is that in the case of an emergency, that individuals can readily, quickly, and immediately exit from the building. So to the extent that there is any impediment created to that, like the panic bars are acceptable because it allows the door to be locked from the outside, but as soon as that panic bar is compressed, the door unlocks. So to the extent that there's any delay, I think that OSHA would take a very careful look at that. And really what they're going to be assessing is whether that delay would create an impediment to the ability of employees to immediately exit the space.
Yeah, and we've had cases in which, doors that were unlocked from the inside, but were otherwise, maybe stuck, the hinges weren't greased up, and it took, some excessive force to put your shoulder into it to open it. OSHA has issued citations for for those types of issues. So a delayed panic bar, yeah, I think they would. I agree. They would take a hard look at that, and it might be something that they would issue a citation for.
All right, it looks like somebody else has added in the chat here that, you know, sometimes you see these kinds of things at airports, and they may show up in other areas. The only thing I'll flag on that is there are going to be certain workplaces where you have potentially overlapping regulatory requirements. In an airport, I know that there are significant Homeland Security regulations, right, or FAA rules that come into play. Those are issues that are best addressed in a very specific manner, because then you have to figure out, you know, which agency's rules are primary, who preempts who, and so if you are in an area that has significant overlapping regulations, maybe it's food manufacturing, you've got certain good practices that you have to follow. You know, you might have interesting overlaps there. You might find OSHA being preempted in some places. So that's a good note from someone particularly on this. The last thing I want to cover on this obstruction question is somebody asked about, you know, what if you have something on wheels? My response is, every time I've dealt with OSHA on this, it did not matter to them if something was on wheels. You know, if you're pairing it with that, you know, supervisor oversight, it's very temporary. Maybe you can make it work, and that probably makes it easier to keep that temporary. But, you know, look, if you've got a janitor's cart on wheels in the exit path and OSHA sees it, they're going to call that a citation. You know, that's a violation. It's something it's blocking. Somebody's going to trip and fall. That's how they'll see it. So it can be useful, but you know, I don't think it gets you out of the citation there, just having the wheels. Lindsay or Dan, anything else on obstructions before we go on?
The one question that I see in the chat here is about roll-up doors leading directly to the outside. We've seen this in a lot of cases where, you know, the roll-up door might be directly next to what is the emergency exit door, which sometimes is locked, and OSHA will issue a citation for, you know, having an exit route or an exit door that's locked and not easily accessed to the outside. And they do not care that the roll-up door, the garage roll-up door next to it, is open. We've made that argument, and, you know, sometimes it is successful, but they're typically looking at that exit door and saying it does not meet the regulatory requirement. And also the garage roll-up door is not the exit door itself. So from a safety perspective, right, you can make the argument that there is no hazard. But oftentimes OSHA's position is going to be, well, that may not be open all the time. It's not a traditional exit door. It's not a side hinge door. They come up with a lot of different rationales for why they issue the citation. So don't rely on that roll-up door is the message there. If you have the exit door, make sure that it is free, unobstructed, and easily open from the inside.
Dan, that's a really great point. I mean, I think what I wanted to flag for everyone, what you're kind of getting at there is, you know, you can still make arguments, but you're not arguing compliance with standard. You're arguing, well, it's a de minimis violation. Yes, we violated, but there's no actual safety impact. So that's always an option when you're arguing citations, but it's never the one we want to go to first. So why we like just straight compliance, it's much easier.
Mm-hmm.
All right, next we'll do some tips related to exit route lighting. Okay, so we had some questions here relating to, you know, when can a sign be self-illuminated? When does it have to be illuminated separately? The OSHA standard itself essentially gives you the option. You can do either, and, you know, depending on the context, you may be pushed sort of toward one direction or the other. You know, in a movie theater, probably you're not going to make sure you've got a spotlight on your exit. You're going to use that subtle self-illuminated sign. You got to make sure it's bright enough, right? We've got some elements here from the life safety code that gives you some much more specific requirements here. Those, you know, if you're lost and don't quite know what to do, it's always useful to go to look at the life safety code, and it gives you a path. If you just want to implement something that someone else wrote very specifically, then that can be a good approach there for the lighting. I think, the last thing is, nobody asked a question about this, but you know, do remember you have to light the passageway itself. So whenever you're going around making sure things are working, they're unobstructed, make sure you have enough light for folks with normal vision, is the way the standard puts it, to be able to see the way out. All right, moving to signage. Talking about normal vision, this relates to a question that someone asked related to, you know, how does OSHA address the fact that, you know, a fairly significant percentage of the population is colorblind? The answer is they don't. As far as I can tell, it is not, you know, OSHA does not, they essentially regulate to kind of a common denominator. If you have if a blind employee, the OSHA standards really aren't going to be enough to protect them. In all cases, you may have to have some additional help there, additional ways out. You know, they're not going to be able to see the exit sign. So generally speaking, that's not going to be an OSHA issue. Dan or Lindsay, you guys are better employment lawyers than I am. Is that going to be an Americans with Disabilities Act question?
As far as from an employment perspective, I don't think it's an issue. The signs itself can be different colors, even if you know, under OSHA standards. So as long as they're in the plain legible letters and meet the size requirements, it doesn't matter.
Yeah. All right. So then, you know, to the extent that you do have, you know, folks with disabilities in your workplace, you know, make sure that you're working closely with HR to provide whatever accommodations are necessary, whether it's related to exit or other issues. That's kind of the way you want to handle that. All right, we had another question about signage. Actually, several questions, and if I can reduce them all and make this overly simplistic, the question is, how much is enough? How much signage is enough? How far apart? They have to be on the floor versus up in the air. You know, my reading of the standard is that they don't give us specifications for how far apart they have to be. It has to be every 5 feet, 10 feet, or anything like that. Really, I would send you back to what we had on an earlier slide that said, you know, if the OSHA compliance officer is in there and gets lost, can't find the exit, you don't have enough signs. It's a very rough rule of thumb, but that's probably what I would go back to is, you know, maybe you take your newest employee out in the workplace and say, you know, how would you get out of here? Put them in a random spot, and if they can't figure it out, you probably need more signage. Dan, Lindsay, anything to add on that?
Yeah, this is a performance-oriented standard, right? The maintenance piece of it. So it is tough to give you, you know, a hard answer, a definitive answer of you need signage or floor markings every X amount of feet or whatever it might be. It's really making that evaluation, and it goes back to if you do get lost or it's not readily apparent which way to go to the nearest exit, you're going to need some kind of signage or floor marking. So to err on the side of caution, you know, if there's more signage, you know, the better, right? If it's easy for an inspector that's coming in to walk into a facility, be it an office or a warehouse, and they see the directional signals to the nearest exit, that's something that you don't have to worry about, right?
Yep.
The one other thing I would add is just that, you know, when you are developing your emergency evacuation plans, for instance, you know, you're sort of doing this analysis as part of that. So you just want to make sure that you are doing that analysis and the development of your plans and procedures, and that you either have, I mean, the best case scenarios, you have documentation of that evaluation that you can go back to as necessary. If challenged on the decisions you've made as far as how to post signage, where to post signage, you know, what is going to be your access route and your discharge, all those questions. Or at the very least, have someone who can speak to that, who can speak to how that was determined and how that was evaluated.
Lindsay, that's excellent advice, because we run into it so many times. Why is it this way? I don't know. The guy who did it isn't here anymore. So it's always good to have an answer for the why. All right, I think you're going to take us home on the last piece of the you know, operationalizing this with procedures, training, and audits. So I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah, and I'm gonna try to move through this pretty quickly because I know we're already sort of over on time. And we've talked about, you know, quite a bit in the context of the substantive material as well as the questions we reviewed. So, you know, it is important to develop written procedures. It is required, you know, to have these emergency evacuation plans, to have thought out what the emergency access routes are, what the egress routes are, how you're going to keep them unobstructed, how you're going to make sure that the exits are accessible and remain unimpeded and can, you know, be easily used. So all of those things should be evidenced and available to employees as well as any OSHA inspector that comes on site in writing. So you'll have your emergency evacuation plan. You'll have written procedures for how that plan, you know, should be put into actual practice in an emergency situation. And, you know, they're sort of the general emergency evacuation plan, or emergency action plan, I should say, that you have to have in place under 1910.38. But there are also several standards that have their own specific requirements related to emergency situations and emergency action plans. So you need to make sure, if there is, you know, another standard, and there's some examples provided here, there is another standard that might implicate what needs to be in your emergency action plan or what needs to be a focus of your emergency action plan, then, you know, you should be aware of those as well. And that will largely be dependent on, you know, the type of facility you have and the specific industry that you're in. And then I think that kind of leads well into this sort of the last major topic that we wanted to review in the context of how this actually works in practice, which is, you know, training and audits. So once you have these written procedures in place, you need to make sure that you're training employees on these procedures. So how to properly maintain clear and unobstructed exit routes. This is going to be really, really important in all contexts, but particularly, you know, in certain types of facilities in certain industries like warehousing, like delivery services, like retail, where you do have areas of your facilities or your stores that there really is a high chance of, you know, a delivery coming in, things just kind of get put quickly somewhere. So making sure that employees are trained on how to, you know, take those materials and temporarily place them in an area that is not going to be obstructing an exit route. And you might try to keep in mind, you know, when these trainings will be most useful in the context of retail. You know, if you have a particular busy time of year coming up, like around the holidays, then it might be a good time at that point to do a training to remind employees how they should ensure that exit routes remain unobstructed, that things don't get placed in front of exit doors. And then also it's important to train employees on these other exit requirements, like signage, like evacuation plans, so that they are aware of those things, that they know how to use those things, how to effectively evacuate in the case of an emergency, and also so they can identify issues. I mean, they, you know, are moving throughout the facility, throughout the workspace during the day, you know, missing an issue with a lighted exit sign, or having, you know, an exit sign fall down. That's something that an employee might notice and might bring to an employer's attention if they're aware of these things as well. So it's really important to do that training, to do that instruction, to discuss these things with employees. And then finally, you know, we definitely suggest regular auditing of these particular standards and these particular requirements. You know, if you already have an auditing system in place or an inspection system in place, making sure that evaluation of exit and exit routes and emergency action plans are part of those regular and periodic evaluations. You know, if you have a serious injury occur at your work site, that is something that's reportable to OSHA, and you think that there's a good chance that OSHA might come on site as a result and conduct an inspection. These are the types of things, you know, an inspection or audit of your facility before that happens, to make sure that these things are addressed. I think Dan said this right in the beginning, you know, this is low-hanging fruit for OSHA when they're on site. These are things that generally are pretty easily identifiable and evaluated. So it's really important to have a proactive audit and inspection plan in place to make sure that you're evaluating these things on a regular basis and addressing them. But then also to ensure that, you know, if there is a chance that OSHA might be on site, you know, that you are reviewing these things, trying to catch these things early, and making sure that they're addressed. Dan or Micah, did you want to add anything else to this?
Just one quick comment. I mean, this goes a long way too. If you do find yourself in a situation in which you are cited for one of these egress violations, having the written policy, the training and the training records, and sample audits to show that you are routinely analyzing these issues. You've had the thought out process of taking a look at these on a regular basis. Perhaps it's the hazard analysis, the evacuation plan. That goes a long way in your defense as well, and your discussions with OSHA about whatever those egress citations may be. So this kind of gets back to the discussion that we had about documentation and the written policies, the training, that all goes to that. It's very important, you know, from a safety perspective, to make sure that your workplace is compliant and your employees are kept safe. But also, if you do find yourself in an enforcement action, having those protocols in place and those written procedures certainly helps in negotiations and your defense.
Great. I think I did see one question about, you know, the requirement to post the emergency action plan or the evacuation plan, whether that OSHA requires that be posted at every exit. I'm not aware of a requirement to post the evacuation plan at every exit. I think that is probably a useful practice if you have the ability to do so. It's certainly helpful as far as ensuring there is an awareness of what the expectations are and how you can effectively exit the workspace, how employees can effectively exit the workspace. But I don't believe that is actually required necessarily by OSHA. It is required that employees be aware of the emergency action plan and any, you know, procedures or evacuation plans as part of that. But I do not believe that it needs to be posted at every exit. So there are no additional points on this. That concludes the substance of our presentation. For additional resources related to COVID-19, we still have our COVID-19 task force page, and there are a lot of resources there. We also have several more webinars coming up the rest of this year, so definitely join us for those. And then we also have our blogs, which we update regularly, have a lot of great resources for additional information on this and other issues. So please definitely feel free to check those out as well. With that, I don't know if there are any additional questions that we haven't already addressed, but everyone will receive a copy of this presentation, and it contains our contact information in there. So definitely feel free to reach out to us directly as well. Dan or Micah, do you have any closing remarks?
No, I think you tied it up well, Lindsay. Thanks everyone for attending today. We had a really productive discussion, and it was a lot of engagement from the participants, so we really appreciate that. And if you have any follow-up questions, again, here's our contact information, and feel free to reach out to any of us with follow-up questions.